Good evening. I'm Mike Cavanaugh of the Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers Union. We're here this evening in the union's Biddeford office discussing labor issues. I'm joined by Congressman Tom Andrews, our 1st District Congressman from Maine, and Burt, Wartell, member of the Portland Central Labor Council and a shop steward at the Bath Iron Works, Local 6 in Portland. Tom, welcome to Biddeford, Maine.
Thank you very much.
Welcome back from Washington.
Mike, nice to be here. Burt, good to see you.
Good to see you. All right. We'd like to talk in this hour that we have about a number of issues that are facing not just organized labor, but workers throughout the country and workers here in southern Maine, both unionized and non-union workers. And we'd like to talk about a few issues, get your reaction, see if we can just sort of share our thoughts about the issues that are facing workers today. And I'd like to start by talking about the North American Free Trade Agreement. This is very briefly for our viewers, this is a treaty that was negotiated by President Bush during his term in office with the Mexican government, and will be coming forward to the Congress in, I don't know, a couple of months' time for a vote. And I think maybe let's start from the assumption that not everybody knows what we're talking about when we talk about NAFTA. And if we could, gentlemen, just let's take a few minutes and describe what the NAFTA agreement is. Burt, would you care to start?
Well, NAFTA, which stands for the North American Free Trade Agreement, can probably better be described as the North American Free Investment Agreement. It doesn't have necessarily that much to do with trade, but under the guise of lifting barriers to trade, does a lot to free up multinational investment and freer movement of capital and jobs across the borders. One of the big problems with it is that you're dealing with countries, Canada, Mexico, and the United States. Canada and the United States, while the differential in wages and conditions is not that great, there's already been a certain loss of jobs, mostly from Canada to the United States in the free trade agreement between the two countries. When you add Mexico into that, where wages are a tenth or less that of the United States, you're looking at probably wholesale export of jobs. In addition to that, the free trade agreement establishes as norm the lowest common denominator, or denominators lower than the common ones, for environmental protection, social benefits, and also for political power, for the power of states and municipalities to promulgate laws protecting their citizens would be challengeable under the NAFTA as submitted by President Bush, or signed by President Bush, not yet submitted to Congress by Clinton, would make them challengeable as unfair trade practices, and which could lead to really massacring some of the better protections that we have under Maine state law.
We have, Burt, just to interrupt you for a second, there are some things going on in Maine around this agreement, but before we talk about that, Congressman, if we could ask you for a minute to, if you could just for our viewers describe what the outlines of NAFTA are. I know early on when this came up for a vote a couple of years ago on the Fast Track Authority, I believe you voted against the Fast Track, along with Labor's position on that. And I wonder if you could describe NAFTA from your perspective.
Well, first of all, Fast Track, the idea behind Fast Track was that we would basically give the administration the authority to not only negotiate an agreement, but require Congress to buy it hook, line, and sinker, up or down the whole package, without any possibility of amending or changing that. And I thought, particularly given the record of the last administration with respect to trade, that was absolutely the wrong thing to do. But NAFTA, Burt's right in pointing out some of the concerns about it. The basic rationale is, I mean, the people that are trumpeting this agreement say, look, we need to bring Mexico into the economic competition, the global economic condition. We need to have an ally and a friend and a trading partner to our south that can be strong economically. It's in our interest to help them be strong, because if they're strong, they can buy our goods. And the basic rationale is, they say, look, yes, we may lose some jobs, as Burt is saying, but in the process, because we're going to make them stronger economically, we're going to create a great market for our products, which in the long run will create jobs in the United States, because then we've got this huge customer right in our doorstep that we can sell things to. Well, the theory sounds very interesting, but the question is, how are we going to find? Oh, and by the way, the other rationale is that, well, we may lose some of the lower paying jobs to them, but we're going to create the higher paying, high skilled jobs, more sophisticated, high tech jobs, and those are the things we'll produce, and they'll produce, so we can buy their goods that are being made at low wages for lower prices, and then they'll buy our goods that are higher skilled, higher wages, and there'll be a market for them. Well, what's the problem with this picture? Well, the problem is, how can anyone in Mexico making 58 cents an hour, which is their minimum wage, buy anything that we're going to make in the United States? And do we want to base our competition, our economic competition, on cheap labor, no environmental laws to speak of that are reasonably enforced, horrible occupational health and safety standards, a government that is notorious for its attacking of legitimate union organizing, so that workers can come together and be empowered to deal with these conditions? In my opinion, if we begin down the road of competing on that basis, not only is it going to be bad for us, we're going to lose jobs, it's going to be horrible for Mexico. It's going to be horrible for their workers. So, in essence, the deal that we have before us right now, because of those factors that Burt, cheap labor, no occupational health and safety standards, poor environmental safeguards, no mechanisms to improve those conditions, no mechanisms to enforce those things. You know, you can say anything in an agreement, but unless you have the means to enforce it, why should we be selling our workers down the river on a promise when the track record and the reality in Mexico in terms of any of these things have been horrible?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I wanted to point out something. I've been certainly following this a lot in the press of late, and there's increasingly, as the agreement gets closer and closer to the point where it may be voted on, there's been much greater press attention to it, which I think is long overdue. But a couple of things that I found just in the last couple of weeks that I think are particularly interesting for our viewers to know. One of them, you made mention of, Tom, that the theory is that we'll lose low-wage, low-skilled jobs and protect the higher-wage, higher-skilled jobs. Well, the New York Times had a big feature, a couple of them, one of which said, and I don't know whether the camera will be able to get this, but this was the front-page feature of the business section of the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, America's newest industrial belt. And it refers to America's newest industrial belt being that area, not in the Ohio River Valley or where the industrial belt used to be located, but now just south of the Rio Grande in Mexico's northern provinces, and talks about not just the jobs that you might refer to as the low-wage, low-skilled jobs, but also high-tech jobs. This story is headlined, "Those high-tech jobs can cross the border too." There's nothing preventing high-tech employment from being exported, and increasingly managers and more highly skilled technicians are finding their jobs being exported even prior to locking this into an agreement. So those are concerns that go beyond what might traditionally be considered, labor's concerns. Clearly, we're concerned with apparel jobs, textile jobs, those jobs which are high labor content, not high technology content, but it's not only our jobs that are threatened. The other point that I think bears mentioning, and again, the Wall Street Journal this week ran an article saying Mexicans too are wary of trade pact, fearing loss of worker protections. And to your point that you can say anything in agreement, but if laws aren't enforced, they don't mean anything. I found it very interesting to know that according to the Wall Street Journal, that according to the Mexican Constitution, workers are entitled to profit sharing, paid maternity leave, government-run vacations. Christmas bonuses of 15 days' pay are mandatory under the law. Severance pay in the amount of 3 months plus 20 days' pay for each year of service is mandatory under the law. A whole variety of protections are supposedly there, but the reality of the situation, of course, is that there's no enforcement mechanism. And as I understand NAFTA as it's now proposed, there isn't anything about the agreement that would require these things to be enforced on the Mexican side of the border.
Right. As a matter of fact, there's no international agreements with teeth. That is, no international commissions or no international enforcement mechanisms that would provide them with teeth. For example, if you violate, there's a couple of problems. One, if you cast a violation, who's going to go in and blow the whistle? Who's going to, first of all, investigate the violation? Even if that group were to find a violation, so what? what happens? There has to be a mechanism in here to have real penalties against a country or a company that violates these things. And right now, they're not there.
Yeah.
You know, I serve on the Small Business Committee, as you know, Mike, and we had people from Mexico come forward into the committee to talk about what it's like there, including business people. And we found, for example, that working conditions were absolutely horrible, even though the laws look reasonable. And there's supposedly protections. The testimony was just absolutely unbelievable in terms of what the real conditions are. And in terms of the business people, the corruption is so rampant in that country, according to their testimony, that payoffs to officials is just a standard piece of doing business, a common, basic way to do business in Mexico. And we would be requiring our businesses to be competing on the basis of, in the case of Mexico, this kind of corruption, these kinds of payoffs.
Well, this is an issue that certainly that has grabbed our attention here in Maine from the point of view of labor, and increasingly others in the state have focused on this agreement because, as Jeff Foe has said in one of his comments about this, Jeff being a very widely respected economist, now head of the EPI and a Maine native, that if this little treaty slips through without notice and without much public comment, we're going to be paying for it for generations. And Burt, I know you've been involved with a coalition of groups here in Maine that have been working on this, and I wonder if you might describe who that is and what you've been doing.
Okay, well, the Maine Coalition for Fair Trade, which has just started to pull together in October of '92 and is growing every week, it's really a very broad coalition of organizations, and the partial list I can read right off the letterhead here is Peace and Justice Center of Eastern Maine, Peace in Central America, Maine AFL-CIO, Maine State Employees Association, Communication Workers, Local 189, Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers Union, Greater Bangor, Central Labor Council, the Sierra Club, Maine People's Alliance, the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association, Home Co-op, National Lawyers Guild, Center for Vision and Policy, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the Maine Greens, National Organization for Women, my local S6 of the Machinists just joined last weekend, and it's continuing to grow. And basically the purpose of the coalition is to bring attention to the problems with NAFTA, and the slogan is no NAFTA or new NAFTA. Side agreements just aren't going to cut it. First of all, there's no real mechanism in the NAFTA as presented to give any weight to side agreements, so they really just serve as window dressing. Basically, to bring attention to NAFTA, to organize public opinion for its defeat. And there'll be a caravan on May 10th that'll be going from, in the early part of May, going from the east coast to the west coast of Canada to protest NAFTA. And on the 10th, and if you know anyone in the Madawaska area, and on the bridge.
Not sure we reached Madawaska yet, but we're getting there.
On the bridge, we'll be meeting with that caravan to help publicize the issue. We hope to introduce some legislation in Augusta to memorialize Congress to oppose NAFTA, and that's the kind of thing that we're organizing.
That's great.
Yeah. Well, Tom, this is we've corresponded about this, and you've been, right on with this from the beginning, and pointing out quite correctly the dangers and the pitfalls with the NAFTA agreement as it's now proposed. What people may not know is that at the moment the administration is involved in some side negotiations. President Clinton has said that he's supportive of the idea, but concerned about the very wide disparity in labor standards, environmental standards, and so on. And I understand his trade team, led by Mickey Cantor, is now in the process of trying to negotiate some supplemental agreements with the Mexican government and the Canadian government. And I don't know if there's anything you can share with us about what you hear going on with those negotiations, and sort of politically, where do you think this is going? Because it is literally on a fast track, and we're going to be facing this issue. You're going to be facing a vote on this issue in the coming months.
Right, and I think the politics of it is extremely important, Mike, because I think these side agreements are being driven by the increasingly widespread dissatisfaction of people with with the agreement. And as the clear problems with the agreement become clearer to people, the treaty is in greater and greater danger. So what we now see is this move toward these side agreements to try to rectify many of the problems that we've identified. I think it's in trouble, quite frankly, in the Congress. I think that there's a wide range of people on all ends of the political spectrum that realize, look, I don't care what your ideology is. Let's use some common sense here. And let's not give away the store and destroy our future in a very short-sighted agreement that has so many holes in it. It really is quite unbelievable. And unless, even if you have the best agreement in the world, it would be absolutely foolish to rely upon the simple word of a country and companies that have systematically violated their word in every aspect of their industries. And you just have to travel or talk to people who live in Mexico to know that that's the case. I think it's in trouble. They know it's in trouble, and they're going to try to address these problems in these side agreements. Now, whether they can or not remains to be seen.
Well, we certainly look forward to that. Unless I think from our perspective, unless the side agreements are something well beyond what we probably expect them to be, we certainly would oppose NAFTA as it's now drafted, and as Burt said, a new NAFTA. That it seems to us, quite frankly, from Labor's point of view, that President Clinton ought to be given an opportunity to negotiate such an agreement himself, without sort of having to pick up the agreement negotiated by Bush, who had an altogether different perspective on what trade should do, and a track record that has been horrendous from our point of view. We've had the loss of, literally millions of jobs across the border, to low-wage havens. So we will be looking forward to, working with you in the coming months to see to it that if those supplemental agreements aren't incredibly strong and give us the right to literally stop the flow of imports, if there are surges of imports that are putting our people out of work, that we're going to want to see the agreement nullified. It seems to me that President Clinton ought not have to have this hung around his neck.
And I look forward to working with you, Mike, and anyone else on this. I mean, obviously there's a lot at stake here, and the more involvement we can get, the better. And Burt, it's good to hear of these activities. The old maxim is, if you can't show a politician the light, you can make them feel the heat. And I think there's going to have to be a lot of light and heat on this issue before it's over. And I don't think people should, misunderstand. I certainly would like to see good, fair trade policies that provide opportunities for people in other countries. And I'd like to be able to sell our goods and our products to other countries. But you've got to do it on the basis of certain principles that we believe in. Fair wages for a fair day's work, occupational health and safety standards, child labor laws, environmental standards, the things that we have worked, and certainly organized labor has been on the cutting edge of winning in this country over the years. And you don't just throw that away you don't throw it away at all. And you make sure that any agreement respects those principles and advances those principles, not only for us, but for the people of Mexico and the people around the world.
Well, that sounds certainly sounds right to me, and I think people understand generally that trade is, we're not going to go backwards. There will be, it is a global economy, increasingly so. There will be trade between nations, and it's going to be done on some sort of balance. And the question simply is, are our wages and standards going to be brought down to the Mexican level, or are the Mexicans going to be able? Is there going to be a development strategy that brings Mexico and the countries of Central and South America up to the U.S. levels, or are we all going to sink to the least level?
Well put. Yep.
Why don't we turn our attention for a moment to another issue that is, on the front burner, certainly of organized labor, but I would say of everyone probably in the country right now, and that's health care. And a lot's been said here about health care, and we've had some meetings about it, and I think maybe it would be best if we could sort of ask you to describe where you see the Clinton plan right now, and then we'll talk a little bit about the American Health Security Act. So.
Well, number one, I don't know where it is right now. Remains to be seen. There's little pieces of evidence out there, little statements are made, and pieces of information that we can gather, but we don't know what the package is going to look like. But number one, let's start with the present system. This system is an absolute mess. I don't think you could design a worse healthcare system if you tried. I mean, 300 Let's start with the very basics before we throw numbers around.
Okay.
If you were sick enough, and Mike and Burt, if you were sick enough right now, whether you had health insurance or not, if you were sick enough, you could go to the emergency room at a hospital, and you could get medical care. But if 2 weeks ago you sought, and you had most conventional health care coverage or no health care coverage at all, and you sought, you wanted to go to a doctor and get some medicine to prevent you from needing to end up in the emergency room, you couldn't get it. So let's just start out by design. By design, we have a system that provides access to everyone for the most expensive, least desirable health care, the emergency room, but very limited access to the most desirable, least expensive part of the system, primary care. I mean, it is completely backwards. It makes no sense at all. And when you look at the hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars, $840 billion we spent last year on health care alone, and you take a look at, okay, how, and the price of this is going up 3 or 4 times beyond the level of inflation. You ask the question, well, where's all this money going? And the answer quickly becomes, if you say, okay, where's the biggest chunk? The Congressional Budget Office told us that between $150 and $175 billion is spent every year in this healthcare system on administration. And of that amount, half of it is unnecessary. It's waste. Now think about that. Tens of billions of dollars not spent to make people healthy, but to push needless paper and pencils around. I mean, it is the most inefficient system on earth, probably, and we continue to pay for it. Now, the only way, I think, that you can address that problem is to have a single-payer system where everyone in the country pays a health care premium based upon their ability to pay, has a health care card that they use to get their their health care, where the doctor or the clinic or whatever it happens to be has one set of forms that he or she has to deal with in terms of getting reimbursement. And if you can do that, right off the top, we're talking about cutting 75, 80, perhaps $100 billion from our health care bill, according to these reports. Now, to me, that makes good common sense, and that's a very good first step to solve the crisis that we have. Unfortunately, Mike and Burt, and I know I'm not telling you anything you don't know, there's an awful lot of special interest, powerful special interest, that's making an awful lot of money off of the status quo. And they're going to be squawking and squealing and doing everything that they possibly can, lining the halls of Congress with their 3-piece suits and wingtip shoes to make sure that something like that isn't passed. And well, that's a sort of a glimpse of what we're facing right now, and what I think the direction is that we need to be going.
Yeah. Well, I would make one comment. Since our members make those 3-piece suits, we're not against those guys wearing their 3-piece suits to Congress. Nor are we against you wearing 3-piece suits, or anyone else. And buy them at John Roberts, because it's a union-owned company. But
and now a word from our alternate.
that's right. This is non-commercial television, folks.
They're Italian suits that I was talking about that these guys wear. Yeah.
But the point you make, I think, is quite correct in terms of the system that we now have, and increasingly people have come to recognize that. I mean, in labor, we have for years bargained for health care benefits and foregone wage increases in the past because people felt at various stages that more of the money should be directed towards providing security for their families on health care issues. And in fact, Burt, maybe you could talk for a second just about, I don't know whether you were involved in the negotiations, but Local 6 and BLW just negotiated a new contract within the last year. And was health care a major issue in those negotiations, or?
I was not involved in those negotiations directly, but yes, healthcare was indeed a major issue in those negotiations.
Yeah.
And our healthcare coverage changed significantly, and it was a key part of the whole package.
Sure.
That was negotiated.
Sure. I mean, that's undeniably the case in everybody's negotiation. I was sitting in this very room yesterday with a negotiating team from one of our local unions here in Biddeford, and the discussion all day was about healthcare and how can we manipulate the current system. And in fact, people have to essentially try to game the system right now in order to be able to access healthcare in the best way possible for themselves and maintain some sort of financial solvency in the process. So the problem at this stage of the game seems to be widely recognized. Those things you've been pointing out for years and we've been screaming about for years are now being trumpeted by everyone, from the American Hospital Association to the Health Insurance Association. Everybody is for reform. Now we get down to the hard part, though, about what does reform really mean. Since clearly there's going to be a reform bill that the administration is developing. But in Congress, there has been an effort underway now for some time to put forward the kind of bill that you were making reference to, a single-payer system that would comprehensively provide health care for everyone as a matter of right of citizenship. And rather than me trying to describe that, you've just become a co-sponsor of this bill, of the McDermott-Conyers-Wellstone bill. And maybe you could take a couple minutes and explain to our audience what that American Health Security Act is, what it consists of, and where it might go.
Well, essentially, it is as you describe it, and it establishes health care for every man, woman, and child in this country. Right now, obviously, you get health care if you're lucky enough or if you're rich enough. And this would say to the 37 million Americans without any health care, you got it. And for the 80 million Americans without health care or inadequate health care, you're going to have comprehensive health care that actually provides for your needs. And then sets up a mechanism that pays for it, that is based upon your ability to pay. And what it does, and I think, and there's been some, a certain process of evolution of this idea. It allows for a universal access to health care and a single efficient system of collecting the money to pay for it, but it gives states around the country flexibility in how they will actually develop their healthcare system. So that, for example, a healthcare system in Maine might look a little different from a healthcare system in New York or in Illinois or Chicago or Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. And we would be allowed to assert our values and our priorities and have a kind of system that would work the best in Maine. One of the criticisms I have of some of the ideas coming forward, filtering out slowly from this task force, managed competition, for example, assumes that we live in a big city with lots and lots of healthcare providers, that we're going to be able to manage the competition between them and ultimately keep the prices low. Well, if you live in a rural area, you only have one healthcare provider. I don't care what kind of a system you have, you're not going to have competition. You're going to have a system that controls healthcare costs and says, look, there's only so much money that we're going to allow to be paid for, to pay for these basic items, while we take the waste and the inefficiency and the things like the runaway cost of pharmaceuticals and bring them under control and reduce healthcare costs that way. That's what this healthcare plan essentially does. And when you sit down and you think about where this money is going, why do we have all this administrative waste that I was talking about? Well, we have 1,500 different insurance companies with thousands of different insurance plans, and it is just, you've got a mountain of paperwork as a result, and a complete monstrosity of a system that you have to deal with if you're a healthcare clinic, and that's what's driving it up. There is no need for that kind of overlap and waste and inefficiency. And with a single-payer system, I don't care what you do, if you don't have a single-payer approach, you're going to have to continue to finance that bureaucracy and that waste and that inefficiency, and that is simply wrong. And Michael, we're talking, we read in the paper the other day about a value-added tax as one of the options of paying for a new healthcare system. Well, unless and until we're willing to bite the bullet and take on those forces that are wasting all this money, how can we, or why should we, ask middle-class working families to pay more out of their pocket for a system that's still broken and inefficient?
Yeah. Well, that's an excellent point, Tom, because from our point of view in labor, we have tried to draw a line between who's on one side or another of the question of administrative waste, and that means essentially the private insurance industry. Largely, it means the private insurance industry. I think that the battle that's going to be joined is going to find the people that you referred to, and the kind of power and money and influence that they can buy in Congress, quite frankly, against a large group of people who aren't just labor, but are many citizens around the country who all pay for, in various ways, the current system. And I think that's an important distinction that's going to need to be made. Again, here in Maine, we're, I think, on a leading edge, frankly. There are a number of states that are trying to develop statewide plans. Here in Maine, Representative Rydell and Senator McCormick have advanced a plan that would fit, as I understand this, very nicely under the kind of framework of the bill that you're co-sponsoring in Washington, to try to deal with a statewide system that eliminates the need for all of the private insurance duplication, and that's going to be a major battle for us to face. And it's we're real pleased that you, as our congressman, are one of those 60-some now, I believe, that are co-sponsors of this Health Security Act.
Well, the exciting thing for me individually, I work very closely with Senator Wofford of Pennsylvania and Senator Datchell of South Dakota on the approach that we're talking about in Maine now. Last year, introduced it last year as an alternative single-payer type system where you allow states flexibility to establish their system in the way they see fit, as opposed to one large, federal bureaucracy. The good news is, on the national front, is the bill that we now have before us. By the way, it's called the same thing that my bill was called last year, but it includes that flexibility for states, which I think is a major step forward. And another other piece of good news is we've taken that model, and that's being proposed in the state legislature here in Augusta. So I'll tell you, it makes so much sense. The difficulty is that you've got to step on some toes to get there. And you've got to face some very, very difficult obstacles and a lot of political pressure in order to make it work. But this, I am convinced, is in the best interest of the people of this state and of this country. And there comes a time when you have to stand up and say no to some very powerful corporate interests and put the interests of the people first. And this is an example.
I would just like to comment on the interconnection of various political issues. You mentioned the high cost of prescription drugs as being one of the problems, and this brings us back once again for the moment to NAFTA, which would, in the intellectual property sections of NAFTA, they would pretty much wipe out generic drugs by protecting patent rights of patents that are owned by major corporations in a much more extreme way than they are now. So, all of these things are connected.
They are indeed, and that can't think of anything much worse than extending their control and their continuing to prop up the high profit levels and the corporate, the CEO salaries of those drug companies, which the president, to his credit, has really focused on. I think that helps to sharpen the focus a bit. I mean, there's lots of culprits out there in the system, but I think just strategically, I don't know whose idea it was, but it seemed like a pretty good one to zero in on one identifiable piece of that opposition that we're going to face.
Yes, and to make things worse, talk about connections of issues, we pay through tax subsidies those large companies to allow them to deduct the cost of those multi-million-dollar salaries. Plus, we pay through a tax deduction for those companies to lobby Congress. So it all comes around, and they get you coming 15 ways to Sunday.
Makes you wonder, folks, who's been writing the laws, doesn't it? Well, fortunately, we've now got people like Tom Andrews who are going to be in there writing laws, and that's going to help balance the scales of justice in our favor, I believe. Tom, I'd like to turn our attention for a few moments to another issue that's also connected, and one that's been particularly important here in Maine and will continue to be so, and that's economic conversion and the whole downsizing of the Department of Defense and the impact on jobs in this area. And I can, Burt works for Bath Iron Works and can certainly talk about that. We have members of our union here in Saco who work at Saco Defense. A lot of union members down the road at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. Everybody is concerned about what is the impact going to be and what are the plans that are being laid to take care of workers and communities that are going to be adversely affected. And I know that's an issue you've been involved with for some time. Perhaps, Burt, you could talk a little bit about the experience at Bath Iron Works and what people at BIW have been facing, and ask Tom to talk about the conversion prospects.
Essentially, we need commercial shipbuilding if we're going to keep our jobs. And I know you had put in some and won some shipbuilding legislation in the last session. Perhaps you could talk about that and let people know what, if any, results have been so far.
Well, there's two ingredients to successful conversion. One, you have to have companies that are willing to do it and are going to make investments and are going to be aggressive, and a workforce that's going to be aggressive and seek to make conversion work. Secondly, you have to have a government that, first of all, is willing to get out of the business's way and the workers' way to make it happen. And secondly, to actually help them to do it. Now, in the case of commercial shipbuilding, I think this is an incredible but true story. Back in 1981, the President stood up and made a speech about free trade. Said that shipbuilders should be basing competition not on the basis of subsidies from government, but on the basis of free trade. So he says, we are going to eliminate any and all assistance to our shipyards. And we called upon our industrial competitors to do the same. Well, two things happened. One, we cut out our subsidies to all commercial shipyards in the United States. But two, all of our competitors, not being stupid, did just the opposite. They increased their subsidies to their shipyards. What happened? 1984, the last major commercial contract for a commercial ship in this country was placed, and now 100% of that market share has gone to those companies who increased the subsidies to their shipyards. Now, what we did, and the first thing we have to tell the government is, look, if we're going to make conversion work, you got to stop undermining the workforce and the industrial base of this country by giving away the store in bad trade agreements like the one that we had with regard to commercial ship. 120,000 jobs have been lost since that President Reagan made that speech, and we just can't afford it. So the bill I put in said, look, we are going, and by the way, I'm on the Armed Services Committee, and we had the Secretary of the Navy coming before us expressing concern that our shipbuilding industrial base was weakening in this country, and that perhaps down the line, if we needed to have Navy ships built, we wouldn't have the commercial infrastructure to do it. So
This was the Secretary of the Navy who was saying this.
Indeed. So I'm saying, so I asked the Secretary of the Navy, well, you know, maybe, have you talked to if you feel this way, have you talked to our U.S. Trade Representative? Have you talked to the Commerce Department? Have you talked to the Transportation Department? Because they're giving away the store while you are complaining about the situation that we're in. Well, the answer was no, so I put a bill in requiring a task force to be established, led by the President, bringing all these departments of government together, purpose, revive commercial shipbuilding in the United States, set up a plan that works, and if that fails, we establish in law that the United States Defense Department will be prohibited by law from buying anything in a country that subsidizes its shipyards. We got their attention with that. That task force is in the process of being identified and set up, and we have an administration that has told my office that they're committed to getting this thing working and up and going. So that's one piece. It deals specifically with commercial shipbuilding. The other general piece of conversion is we need to have an industrial policy in this country. One in which identifies the critical technologies that are going to be important to put this country on the cutting edge of international global competition. We have to be willing to make investments in research and development to bring those technologies to bear. We have to be willing to help companies take that technology, get it off the drawing boards, and put it into the marketplace so we can build these products. It's exactly what Japan's doing, what Korea is doing, what Taiwan is doing, what Germany is doing, and what this country has been unwilling to do because of this idea, this ideology that industrial policy is next to communism. I mean, I had the administration before our committee last year saying, look, we spend $42 billion a year for research and development of high-tech weapons, but yet we spend only $2.5 billion a year in research and development for transportation technology, high-speed rail, the kind of infrastructure that our competitors are investing in that we simply don't have. And the response from that administration was, it's industrial policy, we don't want to be, we just can't be engaged in it. I had the Secretary of Defense before the committee 2 weeks ago. I told him this story. I said, I had the Secretary of Defense sitting there telling me we don't want to engage in industrial policy. I'm asking you, Mr. Secretary, are you willing to engage in industrial policy so we can have a real conversion plan that creates real jobs and develops real industries? The answer was yes. We are willing, he said, to discuss industrial policy, to start looking at some of those investments. Now, saying yes is a very important first step, but it's only a first step. And we have to push very, very hard to have a firm and strong commitment to taking that tremendous resource we have out there and put it to work solving the tremendous problems out there. We don't have a rail system worth the name. Our roads and bridges are crumbling. We don't have the kind of advanced technology that's going to allow us to compete in the future. And unless we're willing to put up the resources and have the guts to stand up and go in this direction, we're just not going to be able to compete.
Well, that's I think those are certainly concerns that are that are real for the people of the companies here in southern Maine that are facing the possible elimination of their jobs through the downsizing. And I think a concern that we would have is, what are the kinds of things that can and ought to be done here at a state level that are going to help advance this? Because a lot of this is, you talk to workers from the shipyard, and it's a lot of talk to them. They don't know where their paycheck is going to come from, or how they're going to be able to transfer their skill in an economy where unemployment is already much too high. And I don't know what the efforts are here at the state level. Burt, have you had some involvement with that conversion task force here? And
No, Jim
Mackey's been doing that.
on the
Yeah.
task force. The task force has been occasionally meeting, and
Yeah.
there's been there's a bill in now by Carol Contos to extend the task force another year, and there are amendments being put on that to demand some meetings and
Yeah.
some reports.
Yeah.
And also, more importantly, there's an amendment going in with it to establish an Office of Economic Conversion
Mhm.
for the state of Maine, which would centralize the going after what federal money there is, centralize efforts for information, for developing planning, and for legislative, developing legislation, and working on the common interests of workers, companies, and communities in the state. There's no funding along with it, and funding these days is hard to find. But that's, I guess, one of the issues that really needs to be confronted in all of the cutting back of military spending. We have a military dependency that's been created by the federal government, and the federal government certainly has some responsibility to fund conversion efforts.
Yeah. I wonder how is that. I mean, that's really a real key issue, is whose responsibility is it to fund conversion, and I don't know where that's at in terms of the discussions in Washington right now. I mean, budget problems are real severe as well, but what do you see in terms of the issue of funding of conversion?
There is first of all, we put up some money last time around. I was on a task force in Washington to come up with $1.5 billion to invest in conversion. The first problem was the administration, last administration, didn't spend any of it. They opposed the legislation, and once we passed it, they refused to spend it. So step one is we have an administration willing to invest some of that money in communities. And there is an administration that's also proposing additional resources for conversion in this next cycle. The problem is, so that's good, but it's not just a matter of money here. Right now, in many communities, including our collective community here in southern Maine, we've had the federal government be a big customer of what we make here, and that's driven our economy. Well, that federal government is not going to be the big customer it's been in the past. I don't care under what administration, it just isn't going to happen. So what we have to do is get from here to the point of finding new customers that can buy new products that we can build with the people that we have here. And the government's role is to get us from point A here to point B. The government's role can't be, I don't believe, simply substituting with public money the money that we were spending for defense. There has to be a transition. There has to be a plan in place where we help businesses, communities, regions get from this defense dependency to private customers that can buy the products that we can make. Right now, we have to grapple with the very difficult question of what are those products going to be? And what role can the federal government play, not just to help people out with unemployment checks or job training, but also what kind of help can we get to develop those new markets and to help businesses, whether they exist here now or whether we like to bring them in, who are willing to make investments to tool up to build the things that we infrastructure, rapid sea lift capacity that can not only use for military uses but to move products around the world. A rapid trains, fast trains, mag levitation, first-class ports. There's a variety of things that we can do. Environmental technology. But we have got to sit down and identify those industries, those technologies, those jobs that our people can do, that our industries are willing to invest in, and then use the government to help us get from point A to point B. Now, I'll tell you something. There is not, in my experience, a company in the country that's been more willing to do the things that companies have to do, and there's been no group of workers in the country that have been more willing to do what workers need to do than the workers of Bath Iron Works and the administration, the management of Bath Iron Works. I mean, there's real investment going on, dollars and time and resources and ideas being put forward, and then they're saying, look, help us out to meet our ends, and I think that's a critical ingredient to this puzzle here. That we're not seeing enough of, and we're going to have to see if we're going to get over this hump.
You know, that brings me to another point, Tom, that I think we are looking at with a lot of anticipation, and that is the new direction that the government might be taking, particularly through the Department of Labor, and Bob Reich's appointment as the Secretary of Labor, and the kinds of just the difference in tone between this administration and the way it views workers and labor, as opposed to the previous administrations, where there was almost an outright hostility. It's certainly an outright hostility to workers' organizations, to labor unions. I mean, no secret to anybody that the Reagan and Bush administrations, did their level best to destroy us. And
Starting with Patco.
And it followed right on through for the next 10 or 12 years. We are now at a point where organized labor, as a mass-based organization of working people that has advanced not only its own members' needs but also broader social issues that have affected most citizens. We're at our lowest point historically in terms of the number of people who are union members. Our obituaries have been written every year. There's but still, I think, a very vibrant and active root organization that exists. And now, some of the things that are being talked about by the administration, by Bob Reich, in terms of looking to joint labor management activities to be sort of to lead us into a new level of competition, I think are real exciting, because they seem to at least give us an opportunity to reassert workers' fundamental rights on the job, that we're not just people who are disposable pieces of the business, but people who've got fundamental rights and who are an important integral part of any thriving business. Now, that's at least an opening for us to make some changes that I think are long overdue. And I'm not sure where the legislation stands at the moment, or if there's legislation even yet introduced, but I wonder if you could comment a little bit about the whole notion of restoring the rights to the American worker under the National Labor Relations Act, which has been used essentially against workers for the last 10 or 12 years. What are you hearing, or what are you seeing happen in terms of improvements in the laws under which labor operates, both our rights to organize, our rights on the job, people's rights to healthy and safe work environment? Those are some fundamental rights that we care about, and I wonder if you can comment about
Well, right from the get-go, and you said it yourself, I mean, there couldn't be a more different attitude on the part of administration. It's night and day, it's 180 degrees, and there are finally people in the White House that understand that, you don't have to be a member of a labor union to appreciate things like the minimum wage, or child labor laws, or occupational health and safety standards, the 40-hour work week. Those are all things that we can thank organized labor for, and they've been a critical part of our economy. And once you take away, or once you attack and take away the rights of people and attack labor unions, you're attacking those very protections and those very victories that were won and have benefited everybody else. The second realization I can see in this administration is that the theory of trickle-down supply-side economics has just been a failure, as well as a fraud. I mean, the basic idea is that we line the pocket, that the real wealth of this country could be found in the deep pockets of the very, very wealthy. And that if we gave them enormous tax breaks and, quote, got off their backs, all that money would be invested in new plants, new equipment, new productivity, and we would all benefit. What happened? Well, we know that 95% of the wealth created in the 1980s went to 2% of the population. That for people that work for a living, saw their incomes go down relative to the cost of living by up to 30%, while their taxes went up. Meanwhile, investments in new plants went down, investments in equipment went down, productivity rates continue to lag way behind our competitors, and this country's economy, as a result, is on its knees. Now, this administration, I think, recognizes the reality that the true wealth of this country is not in anyone's deep pockets. They're in our people, our workers, our children. And if we're going to get this economy moving, you're going to have to invest in that source of wealth, our people. You start with basic respect for people and their ability to work, get a fair wage for their labor, to work in decent, healthy conditions, to be able to look forward to a future and a secure retirement, to have health care as a matter of right, not as a matter of privilege, to be able to look forward to their children, having a better standard of living. And that means investing in education, in guaranteeing health care, just changing 180 degrees our relationship with the real strength of this country, our workforce. And Michael, I don't know specifically what kind of legislation we're going to see in this current session, but I do know that the change of attitude, which is of course the critical first step, could not be greater with this administration. Now what we have to do is keep the pressure on and make certain that the administration and the Congress knows that we expect action. We appreciate the rhetoric, we appreciate the sentiment, but you can't take the sentiment to the bank. Sentiment doesn't put bread on your table. You need action. And whether it be the health care package, or whether it be education, whether it be insisting upon eliminating, outlawing strike breakers once and for all of those things are the concrete steps that we need to take in order to turn this thing around.
I certainly would agree. I think that we are going to be, as far as labor is concerned, coming forward with a legislative package that's going to deal both with reforming our labor laws, which have been weakened considerably over the years, because we think that if we're going to make the country competitive, if we're going to try to regain a position of preeminence in terms of the world economy, and of course we've fallen down, but if we're going to try to regain that, it's going to have to be based on our workforce, that, as you say, that's the primary resource that we have as a country. So there will be a legislative proposal for reforming our labor laws, as well as a proposal for reforming our OSHA laws. Health and safety is a big issue, and it's a topic all to its own, and we're going to have a show about health and safety issues upcoming for Workers' Memorial Day here. But I know that one of the primary elements of that legislation is going to be requiring companies that are maybe 10 or 20 employees or more, requiring them to maintain joint labor management health and safety committees. That being sort of what one might think is a common sense approach. But of course, anytime you start talking about mandating anything to business, they get certainly all shook up about it and don't want anybody telling them what to do. But they're at the same time they're screaming about their high cost of workers' compensation, which clearly are very high, and we're screaming about the high rate of injury on the job and death on the job in the United States. We need to take a new look at what our health and safety standards in this country are going to be, and requiring joint labor management activity on a variety of issues, starting with health and safety, we think is the right road to go. So I know we're going to be approaching you with some very specific legislation along those lines.
Great.
And look forward to that.
Well, I look forward to that.
Yeah. Good. Burt?
Well, on another subject, these, again, going back over the history of the 80s, where we saw this massive transfer of taxpayers' money that used to come back from Washington to the states and localities, now being kept and used for various fun projects like bailing out the savings and loan thieves and helping companies buy and sell each other's losses to control each other's tax credits. One of the real unfortunate results of that whole orgy is being felt now by the ratepayers in the Portland Water District in terms of meeting our clean water obligations without any money to do it other than borrowing and having to raise rates. Projects that previously were supported, at least partially by the federal government, are now being thrown on states and localities with no help whatsoever. What, if anything, is being done in Washington now with the new administration and the new attitudes to help turn that around and take some of the pain away from localities?
If you take a look at the president's investment package, I mean, the basic philosophy is that we have let the basic building blocks of a strong economy wither away for lack of investment in this country. And as a result, our productivity rates are down and we're suffering. Meanwhile, we've put the burden onto the backs of the property taxpayer, and of course the property tax is the worst, most unfair tax of all, because nobody, you may be out of work, but if someone decides your property is worth 3 or 4 times what you paid for it, your property tax goes up, even though your ability to pay that property tax may have gone down. The president has called for an increased commitment, this is in his investment package, of these basic building blocks, including water, sewer, roads, bridges, rail systems. And that generates, as we know, a tremendous return on investment. Now that we've been reading all about this so-called pork barrel stimulus package, the $16.3 billion. And of course, as you may know, Burt, in that package is help with respect to this kind of infrastructure in terms of water. But also, the so-called pork piece is $2.5 billion to go directly to states and cities and towns through a program called the Community Development Block Grant Program, to do the kind of things that they think are important, but are tired of burdening their property taxpayers for paying for. And the basic idea is that perhaps local communities and their elected officials know a little bit more about what's important for a city or town than people in Washington, D.C. Well, what happened was our Republican friends got on the phone and called some of these cities and towns and says, well, gee, if you get some of this money, what are you going to do with it? And some said, well, we have a major problem. In fact, one did say we've got a major problem with unemployed youth in our community, and there's a lot of violence, and we want to use our money to build a recreation center. We'd rather, and we're going to build a pool, because we'd rather have kids swimming than shooting. And so that's what we think is important. That's what we're going to do. Well, of course, that becomes that's a big pork barrel project, and it's all in there.
Yeah.
But we see evidence of a movement of this administration to making those kind of investments. A, because it's good for the economy, and B, property taxpayers have just been taking the cleaners for too long.
Well, Tom, thanks very much. I think that's maybe a point where we're going to need to leave this conversation. I would point out to our viewers who tuned in late that you've been listening to a program and watching a program. I'm Mike Cavanaugh from the Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers Union.
This is Mike's World, right?
This is sort of Mike's World.
Mike's World.
Come on. You guys promised you wouldn't do this now. We're on. These are a couple guys I don't really know, but they wandered in here. This is Congressman Tom Andrews, who was looking for a place to get in front of a camera this afternoon.
That's right.
Tom, thanks for coming by.
Thank you, Mike.
And this is Portland Water District Trustee candidate, Burt Wartell, from Local 6 of the shipbuilders in Portland. We want to thank you, Tom, very much, really, for coming by and talking with us today, and certainly look forward to working with you on these issues. And
Mike, it's my pleasure. You've been a totally excellent host.
Yeah, right. All right. Well, great. Okay, thanks.
It's been fun.
Good. Very good. Good evening.